it's not just about changing the conversation. It's about changing the goal of the conversation. It's not just about trying to be right or trying to prove somebody wrong, but it's about seeking to understand, seeking to learn, and seeking to grow. And when that's the objective of a conversation, that's when everybody starts to win.
If you don't understand, don't misunderstand. And a lot of people, when they don't understand, they already draw their conclusion or make assumptions that their perception of what they understood is the reality. If we're not trying to be right or trying to make somebody else wrong, but we're seeking clarity, that's where the bridge can actually be crossed.
All right, welcome back to another episode of It's Not So Black and White, coming to you live from the epic location of my basement spare bedroom, and I don't even have the backdrop to hide it, so everybody gets to enjoy the beautiful 1970s trim that adorns the walls of my spare bedroom. And with me, two very special guests, Chris, who's a regular contributor when she decides to show up and she's not hurting cats, and KSD, or Dr. Krista Scott Dixon, who in our world is known as a big deal because she is a curriculum director for precision nutrition, but she's also got some really interesting views when it comes to politics, society, and culture, and some great insights into human behavior. And I think that's really what we want to dive into today, because the world's kind of thrown into a lot of chaos, a lot of conversations around misinformation, disinformation, confusion, and it seems like we're in this really weird period of time in human history where there's I don't want to use the term information war because that connotes a certain a certain political commentator, but there's something like that taking place. So I'm going to lob it over to you, KSD, and just let you give people a little background on yourself and kind of what you do, and then we'll riff from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. And if you see my eyes wandering around the screen, it's because the setup of the screen is like I have, you guys are all over the place. So I'm trying to make eye contact, and then I keep remembering that that's actually not really eye contact. But yeah, so my background is, I've it's interesting because we're filming this on what I call my second birthday. And everyone can have a second birthday. You can have as many birthdays as you like, really. But it's the day that I left my academic career without a plan at all, and just kind of went out into the world and made a big life change. And so that was about 15 years ago. So it's kind of fortuitous that we're doing this. But basically, my career and my educational pathway has had lots of twists and turns. And like I started out, I thought I wanted to be an artist, and I did a fine arts degree, and then I thought I wanted to be a teacher, and then I, went into kind of women's studies, social justice field, and that's what I did my PhD in, and then did 5 years in academia as a university professor and a researcher and a teacher, and then was like, screw this, academia sucks. And I'd been working kind of in health and fitness in a parallel way as well. And so I came to work for Precision Nutrition, designing their curriculum. And so there's been this kind of like very windy path of teaching, coaching, politics, social justice, trying to make sense of it all. And it's funny because I was just recently asked, like, how do you bring together such diverse material in the way that you think? And I'm like, I've just done a lot of different things, and over time you start to see like there's connections between things, right? And I think that's very germane to the goals of this show, where it's like we are looking for the threads that connect people as well as the distinctions between people, but it's a lot more nuanced, I think, than a lot of folks realize.
Yeah. Now I'm immediately curious by something you said, and maybe you don't feel this way now, but at the time you'd said that academia sucks, and I'm kind of curious why you might have felt that way. If you kind of looking back, maybe I won't preface with anything further. Actually, I'm just curious why.
Yeah, I still feel that academia sucks. Okay. And academics, feel free to fight me on this one. I will take your hate mail. But the data do show that rates of mental illness are extremely high in academia, whether you're, a professor, like whether you're faculty or whether you're a graduate student. So I think if you're listening right now and you're doing your PhD or you have a postdoc or you're contract faculty, you're like, okay. And the reason I say that, and I'm a bit flippant about it, but I think there's really unfortunate elements in academia. So for context, I'm a second generation academic. My father was an academic. And so I came to this very naturally. And I literally grew up being taken to the university, when the babysitter didn't show up, my dad would just haul me along to classes, and I would sit in the library or sit in the back of his lectures or whatever. And so like I was immersed in this environment, like almost literally from birth. And I thought it was terrific. Like I loved the smell of the library. And I loved the idea that you could just learn anything at this place. Like it seemed like this really magical place. And even as when I was faculty, I was sneaking into undergraduate lectures about things that I wanted to learn because there's 500 people in there. It's not like anyone's gonna bust me for sneaking into a stats lecture or something like that. So the premise of it is amazing. It's a place where knowledge concentrates and people push you to think critically and learn how to learn, and you can learn any topic that you want. The downside is once you become in the machine, once you become a graduate student, once you become employed by the university, you start to see that this is actually a very dysfunctional system. It functions a lot like a toxic family in the sense that you have a replication of power dynamics over multiple generations. And it's very organized around power and like a kind of like, it really reflects its feudalist roots, right? Okay. Power is very concentrated and there's a lot of like Game of Thrones stuff happening.
Really? Yeah.
And it seems like an awesome job. Like you imagine, oh, I'm going to get my, corduroy jacket with the little patches on the elbows and walk around and just be smart all day. But really it's a factory, and it's a factory that's become increasingly corporatized, increasingly bureaucratized, increasingly like there's a huge now strata of middle management that just like sucks up funds. And if you're contract faculty, like the good jobs are far and few between. And if you break it down by an hourly wage, it's like, oh, like the day that I calculated I could make more as a personal trainer than I could as a university professor was like the beginning of the end. So on the surface, it seems like such a great job, but it's incredibly high stress. It's incredibly thankless. Rates of burnout are very high. Wages are comparatively low. Again, if you're contract faculty, if you're a postdoc, I mean, you're really not making much money at all for someone who is extremely highly trained and put a lot of time into their schooling.
So would it be fair to, and I don't know if this is like an accurate sort of analogy or not, but maybe thinking like it would function better if it was somewhat of like a socialist type system. And I'm trying to put a political lens on this. I don't know if that's accurate, but it's actually more functioning kind of like, I don't know if a monarchy is the right term, but it's functioning as you described with power concentrated versus, any sort of power shared in a collaborative kind of environment. Here, it's more people are fighting for position rather than collaborating and working together and collectively sharing knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, part of it has to do with what is valued. And some universities have done this better than others. So typically to get a tenure track position, first of all, there has to be a tenure track position, right? So that means that there has to be funding available, whether privately or publicly, depending if it's like a private or public university. In Canada, most universities are public. There has to be money available to hire this tenure stream person. And then to get tenure, you have to spend a number of years jumping through hoops to justify your existence. And most universities prioritize research that it's almost like exposure, like getting you celebrity dollars in a way. So the value of the research is part of it, but a lot of it is like, did you publish in a big name journal? Did you, were you attached to a big name supervisor? Like there's kind of a fame game there as well. Teaching is typically not as valued. So you get into the situation where what happens is you are trying to produce research, but you have to apply for grants to fund your research. So you spend most of your time writing grants and not doing your research. You also have to spend time teaching, which is not really valued. And then you also have to spend time what's called service, which is like sitting in committees, right? So there's a huge amount of work that you're doing and very little of it is valued. And so kind of to your question, I think one of the immediate solutions would be to devise a system where, people were able to excel at the things that they were truly good at. Because very few people are excellent at service, teaching, and research.
Right.
So step number one would be to say, look, do you love teaching? Like, are you the person that's going to take the young minds of the next generation and like give them a good time and really educate them? If so, here's a pathway for you where you can make a living wage, where your work is valued, where you can be rewarded, and you don't have to do anything else. You can just show up and be a great teacher. I think that's part of where the system is really broken, honestly.
Right.
think it's really interesting because I think the perception of university is it's a high prestige, high status environment, right? But actually when you're in it, that's not how it plays out. It turns into more like it's not quite nepotism, but it's definitely hierarchical in that way of like, I've worn the special pants for this period of time, and I'm gonna choose who wears the special pants next time, and it may not be based off of skill or talent, like you're saying, right? It's not what it appears to be. And I didn't work in academia, but I worked for the university for a number of years, and I worked in human resources. And some of the things I saw going on with the grant writing and with how the programs actually functioned once they had received grant money was really surprising to me. So it's interesting to hear it from your perspective as well, having come up through that.
And, like in terms of, I mean, if we're talking about kind of progressive politics, I would say there's another huge issue, which we haven't really touched on, which is the replication of systemic discrimination, right? Intentional or not. And that's how systemic discrimination works, right? So if I'm a senior faculty member and I'm looking for a candidate that I think is doing a good job in terms of, ticking all of the boxes of what good job means, well, who am I going to choose? I'm going to choose someone who looks like me, who thinks like me, who does scholarship like me, very likely, because that's how human brains work, right? Unless my institution has a really diligent diversity, equity, inclusion mandate and safeguards to make sure I follow it, I'm just going to keep reproducing this behavior, this world that I was inculcated in, because I've been marinating in it for 30, 40 years. Right. So I don't know anything different. And so when I see scholarship, that's progressive or radical or interesting or different than mine, I'm like, scary. I don't know about this. This is scary. These people don't look like me. And that's, it's sometimes it's conscious, but sometimes it's not. And that's where we really have difficulty. And a lot of, progressive faculty of color, faculty who are doing all different kinds of research programs, queer faculty, any kind of marginalized faculty will tell you, like, it is an upstream, thankless battle that a lot of the times you don't win.
The word systemic kind of gets thrown around, and I think for an average listener, they might have maybe a robust grasp of what we're referring to, because we hear it in terms of, as you described, like systemic discrimination or systemic racism. When we use systemic in this context, what are we? I wonder if you could describe like kind of what we're referring to here, because I believe it's a term that gets misunderstood and probably thrown around in media to sort of create these emotive responses from people, when in reality there's something really valid to what's being described here.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I really appreciate the opportunity to explain it, because it is something that's not well understood. And I think when we talk about, the isms, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever, people immediately feel defensive. Like if you're a decent, good human being, you immediately feel defensive, because either you're upset about what's happening in the world, or you want other people to know that that's not me, right?
Right.
I don't do that. I don't think that. I'm a good person. I mean well. I try to help. I do this. I recycle.
Right. Yeah.
Like I'm a good person, damn it. And so when we talk about the isms and the phobias, I think a lot of people's defense mechanisms get immediately activated, because what happens is the conversation gets translated into individual level stuff and individual level characteristics, like who are you as a person? Am I a racist as my identity, right? Versus, do I have racist thoughts, or have I been taught racist beliefs, or do I have anti-racist thoughts and anti-racist beliefs, right? So it's not a thing that I am, but it's stuff that I may be doing, it's behaviors. But it doesn't stop there, right? And so systemic refers to like systems, structures, processes in our society. How does the education system work? How does the political system work? I mean, a super simple example is like, let's say you want to go out to eat and you've broken your leg and you're on crutches. And the restaurant that you want to go to has a set of stairs up to the front door. Or maybe once you get inside, there's stairs down to the bathroom. That was a very Toronto thing when I lived in Toronto. All the restaurants in the basement, right? Which is like systemically ableist. So the restaurant isn't sitting around going, how can we screw over, mobility impaired disabled people today? But in the design thing, what we start to see is that it disadvantages some groups over others. I remember this very clearly. Like, I'll take a side tangent and talk about that. Like, my mother was in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and it manifested in mobility disorder. So we went out to a restaurant in the early stages, and she went down to the bathroom and like got stuck there, and I had to go rescue her. And then I was like, luckily she's a little woman, and I was like, I literally have to carry this woman back up the stairs because she cannot access, this restaurant, even just with a mild mobility disorder. So, and it's these little things you don't think of until you're in it, right? And I define privilege very simply: stuff that you don't have to think about.
Yeah.
And I became financially privileged the day I stopped knowing exactly how much money was in my wallet or my bank account, right? Because when you're financially non-privileged, you know exactly how much. It's like, I got 32 cents in there, or whatever it is, like, it down to the cent, right? So when we talk about systemic and structural racism, homophobia, ableism, whatever, ageism, it's that how things work in a society disadvantages some groups over others. Sometimes it's intentional. And there's some, a great example of that is the urban planner in the US, I think in the 60s, who did a lot of work in designing cities so that buses could not go under certain underpasses. And this was specifically done to ensure that the kind of people who take public transit, i.e. lower income, generally racialized communities, could not access certain parts of the city on a bus. So that was very intentional. It's known.
Right.
But they can also be unintentional. It's just stuff you don't think about. That's really what it is. And so again, whether that's our educational system, political system, transit, infrastructure and society, there's all of these pieces that give people unequal opportunities or put barriers in their way. Again, whether intentional or not. Does that make things clear? Feel free to ask clarifying questions if I haven't really given.
I have a long list of questions here.
Okay, good.
I'm like, how much time do you have? This triggers so many, very interesting questions. But even the idea of equality and then equity, which are not like parallel terms, but often get equated or conflated. Also, are we ever going to be able to achieve, perfect equality, or is maybe that not even the goal, but even if that's not the goal, because I wonder if sometimes this gets thrown about as like, okay, we're never going to achieve equality, so why should we even try?
Yeah, so screw it. Yeah.
Right. And I think sort of wrapped up in that as well. Let's say for someone like myself, in certain areas, like I recognize I'm fairly privileged. Other areas I don't feel so privileged, but I grew up in Canada. I'm a part of a visible majority and male, so I think already there's a couple of things there. But so then when we start to introduce measures like this, if this is the way that I've grown up and this is sort of the way I'm accustomed to, where I don't have to think about these things, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, now you have to start thinking about these things, and I'm like, well, jeepers, you're just like screwing me around. That sounded like Ricky from like it's like Trailer Park Boys almost. We're getting there.
Small town Canada. Can't take it out of you.
Yeah. So that kind of idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think the thing to emphasize, and this is another really critical point, is that equity and inclusion and enhancing our opportunities for diversity is not a zero-sum game. So if you win, I don't lose. That's how this works. So a good example of that is another structural example. When you walk on a sidewalk and you arrive at an intersection or a driveway, the curb goes down so that wheels can roll over it, right? Now, that was done, to improve rolling wheels over it. But that is something that is enhanced. If you're rollerblading, if you've got a stroller, if you're in a chair, if you have a mobility issue, now you don't have to get up over the curb. Like, an improvement for one group of people makes life much better for everyone. Accessible design is another great example of that. You might make things accessible for one group of people, but you make the world much better for other people. It's like, oh, this door handle is like way easier. My hands work just fine, but this lever door handle is way easier. Or, sinks at different heights. I'm short, right? Some of the lower sinks that are made to accommodate chairs are just like perfect for me. I'm like, good job, right? So, I think there is this idea that there's only a limited pie, right? And if one group gets a slice, then other people don't get a slice. And I think in most cases that's really not true. improving access to education. Everyone wins out of that one, especially early childhood education. Canada just passed legislation around accessible childcare. Like, that is probably going to significantly improve the health and well-being of our society 20, 30 years down the road, if families now can pay $10 a day for childcare, right?
And
so, and it's not screwing over non-parents.
Right. And can I give a shout out in Canada here? Like, my wife gets up to 18 months of mat leave, which has been phenomenal. My little man is 13 months old right now. And, I think in some countries they get maybe 4 or 6 weeks. And now...
It doesn't exist. I mean, I had my daughter in the Czech Republic, and so there was up to, I think it was a sliding scale. You could get up to 36 months, but at different percentages of your pay.
Yeah.
So I was a manager at the time of a language school, and I think I was eligible for something like, if it was 36 months, it was 30% of your pay. And the shorter the period of time, the higher the percentage of your pay it was. Yeah. So, it's a whole nother topic, what's going on in America with this kind of thing. But I think I want to go back really quickly to this underlying idea of fear, of scarcity that this underpins in society. And I think my question is sort of like, how do you see us getting out of that? How do you see us like managing fear in people of these changes, and fear that like there is only so much pie to go around?
I'd say, that is a huge question. And
we got all night, right?
I don't know if I can fix that, but I will say that, one thing that has been suggested, I won't say shown or demonstrated, but suggested in brain scans of people with different political inclinations, is that people who tend to be much more rigid and traditional seem to also have a higher activation of their fear centers.
Yeah.
So this implies, it doesn't prove, but it implies that something about a fear of change is distressing for people. That change implies some lack of safety, some unpredictability that is frightening. And, so if I kind of take an attachment psychology perspective on this, I start to ask myself about how we can make things less threatening for people, how we can make change less threatening for people. It's almost ironic that like the childcare kind of just wandered into this conversation, because I see what they're teaching as social and emotional skills in early childhood education these days. Now, this is in British Columbia where I live, but it's starting to become a movement. And there's now a greater emphasis on social and emotional learning in schools at the elementary level, especially. And this produces brains which down the road are less afraid of change and feel more adaptable. So, it's kind of a hard question to answer. How do we do this? But, the answer is very much on the human scale, right? And there's a wonderful project called the Human Library. We had this in Toronto. I don't know if it's elsewhere, but you could go and like check out a person and just like hang out with them and talk to them for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. Someone especially not like you.
I so want to do that.
Yeah, it seemed tremendous. And I think that's not to be all, kumbaya about it, but we can really only change that kind of fear with things like attachment, starting to like prioritize attachment or connection or relationality. But I think another way is just demonstrating to people that there's not scarcity, right? That a win for the side of good or social progress is typically a win for everyone. And I think the more that we can point to the benefits of that, public health, great example of that. Or like if you get vaccinated, then I don't get sick, right? Like it's a win-win situation for me. And I think those conversations, it differs in different cultures. And I'm glad you mentioned the Czech Republic. The conversation looked very different in the US, which is very individualistic, very like my way or the highway. Like I got my bubble and I'm sticking to it. Canada's a little bit more collectivist, other societies more collectivist still. So there's different kind of like fundamental beliefs about contribution and about what I get. And like, as an example, I don't have a child. Okay, my partner has a child, but I don't have a child. So why should I give a crap about the educational system? Well, I understand that if I belong to a highly educated society, it's probably going to be a better place to live. So I happily pay my taxes that go to schools, even though I don't directly benefit. So all that is to say, I don't know how we can introduce a more collectivist mindset, but I have seen that it can be very successful on the micro scale of just getting to know people and interacting with different kinds of people.
Yeah, I already want to start a human library just because I love talking to people.
Yeah, it's so rad.
I mean, I think this is what travel is about too. And you know, that is the human library. And if you really fully embrace the experience of being outside of your culture, rather than just looking around when you're in another place, deciding that they're doing it wrong and, you know, you have things to teach them, it's incredibly transformative. And, you know, as I used to be a cross-cultural trainer, I would help families integrate from one culture to another. And it wasn't just from like my culture into another one or vice versa. It was like lots of times just random. It was a random grab bag of people that you had to sort of be like, let's figure out what the rules are here. Like, what is it that these people value? And I think what you were saying about, you know, America being an incredibly individualistic society versus Canada being slightly less individualistic. And the pandemic was super instructive in how like individual countries and cultures, like where their values were and what they prioritized. And you could see it in their policy making. And it was such a fascinating experiment. I mean, not that anybody dying is a good experiment.
Theorist.
No, but in no way was that what I was implying. It was more of a like, we had this huge amount of data on this huge scale across these huge variables that is super instructive if we can put that data together and do some comparative kind of analyses of it. And they're doing that, right? And they're looking at this stuff, and America's getting pretty uncomfortable because we're coming out on the bottom of a lot of these metrics, a lot of them very consistently. And that just really butts up against the paradigms of what America is about, right? Like, we're supposed to be the best and we're the leaders and we're all these things. And that the data just doesn't support it at this point. It's a really difficult time, I think, for America as a country, if we look at it from that perspective, because the things we think about ourselves with our individualism and our, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality is not working out so well for us at the moment. You know, I hate to quote the peon chestnut, but how is that working for us? It's not so great, right? And I think it's a really, really hard pill to swallow. And you know, I'm married to a Brit. So the 4th of July in our house is always a good time.
That's awkward.
You would be amazed how many people ask him, like, so do you celebrate? And he's like, no. No. I mean, why would I, right? And some people genuinely even don't know that, like, that's who we were getting independence from, right? Which is a little stunning sometimes. But it's really interesting to see how England views America. And it's not particularly pleasant, but it's kind of like we're this unruly adolescent who decided to go out on their own before they were ready. And they're sort of watching us fumble around. And there's Canada and Australia, the other countries that were also English Empire colonies. And they're all looking around going, oh gosh, if you had just done what mom and dad said. You know, there's this very much this paradigm in England about how they talk about America versus the other ex-colonies. And it's really interesting because Americans would totally disagree with that.
Well, I will say the conversation is getting a little more awkward for mom and dad because there's a lot of decolonization narratives happening. And you know, in British Columbia, the indigenous voices are extremely strong. And there's a lot of, you know, like very progressive, like decolonization conversations going. Yeah. So it's like, it used to be mom and dad, and now it's like, oh no, can we get rid of toxic, narcissist mom and dad? They were very destructive.
Yeah. they need some skills, right? Like we need to help them with that. And it's really, it's interesting to look at it on these different levels, right? Of like, we can look at countries interacting with each other, and we can look at individual populations within countries interacting with each other. And I think the idea of systemic is so much bigger than we really give it credit for. I think that's why people struggle to really wrap their heads around it, because there's, there's your family systems too. And when you work with nutrition coaching with people, you're working within their family system. Yeah. I mean, hands up is all of us who've been nutrition coaches for people who want to make changes, but their family structure doesn't allow them to, because there are traditional meals and traditional times we eat and traditional things that you're not allowed to change very easily. So, you know, even on these smaller scales, we can see how difficult it can be, how scary it can be to try to affect even a small amount of change.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to shine a bit of a light here on something and get your take on it. You mentioned like the sort of indigenous, like reconciliation and decolonization, and that being like this awkward conversation, because I think, again, for many people, what we're going to hear is something along the lines of, well, I had nothing to do with this. I had no choice in this. I was just like literally born into this country in this sort of situation. And maybe what we're grappling with is like, how far back do we try to go when we're trying to rectify wrongs? Like, how, where do we, or is there a line that should be drawn, So, because this is like a really interesting thing to, and it's quite complex for us to try to sort of pull on that string and unravel it, where we go, how far back do we want to trace this? And again, or should we even try to draw a line?
I mean, I hate to jump in with a Will Smith quote. I'm going to do
You really want to go there?
I do. I really do. And what did he say? He said something like, it may not be my fault, but that doesn't mean it's not my responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a profound question in a way, because I think that both things are true, right? And so, if I say to you, like, I am coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, in this place that some of us call Vancouver, like, that starts to connect me to a history of people who are here, right? And so connecting to our history is a very powerful thing, for better or for worse, because there's a lot of stuff in our history we look back and we're like, ooh, wish that wasn't in there, right?
At least you can do that in Canada. I mean, we're still working on getting to that place down here of looking back and going, oof.
But like Canada likes to delude, white middle class Canadians like to delude themselves that they were kind of a benevolent force, and it's very difficult to look back and like, we're now uncovering, I can't remember, I don't know what the number is at this point, but hundreds of graves of Indigenous children who were forced to go to residential schools, and so that's just one group of people, never mind the Japanese that we interned and the Ukrainians. And once you start to kind of draw that thread, it's just like, oh, like, this is gnarly stuff to look at. And so one piece of the healing, though, is looking unflinchingly at the stories and the history, and like forcing yourself to look back and go, that happened. And I think this is, like, in a way, an essential task of adulthood. Like, you grow up when you can look back and see what happened and kind of will yourself to see it, right? And to understand how your story is connected in there, however that is. And then, like you say, to say, okay, it's now, or, it's Monday, April 4th, 2022. What can I do starting right now? And the analogy I think of is like, I come in and there's poo on the floor. It's not my poo. I don't know who made the poo.
Human or animal?
But now there's, I don't have a dog, so now the mystery deepens, right?
Right.
There's a lot of questions coming up. But regardless of who made the poo is on the floor, and I have to clean it up, right?
Yeah. And to clarify, like, one of the reasons why I pose the question that I do is I try to think about the differing perspectives and the different questions that people have based on the positions that they hold. So exactly that, someone saying, how far back do we go? So I want to ask those questions from that perspective, because I think it's important if we're going to help, I think, create change, which is part of what this conversation is about. Part of it is meeting people where they're at and understanding maybe even how they got to the place they're currently at, rather than saying, I expect you to jump over this giant gap here all by yourself. It's like, how about I meet you and then let's go across the bridge together, rather than say, you have to try and make this giant leap by yourself.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, because, it's very easy to look at any group of people, or any one person really, and say, well, why are they acting like that? Right. I think to continue with the example of Indigenous people, or even racialized people, but I think Indigenous people in particular, if just it's on my mind because I live here. There's a lot of conversations around intergenerational trauma, right? And so it's like, why is someone in 2022 struggling with X, Y, and Z? Well, it's because their parents went through this, their grandparents went through this, their great-grandparents went through this. So if you start to kind of connect the links in the chain, oh my gosh, that makes a ton of sense why this person is feeling, doing, and experiencing this. And it's not some inevitable destiny, right? It's not like, well, I guess I'm doomed by 300 years of whatever happened. But it's almost like there's all of these threads that weave into a human being, right? All these threads of stories and choices and experiences. And in order to understand what is happening now, we have to look back down the chain. We have to look at the threads that wove together to make them, if we have any hope of changing. Because, to take it to coaching, I can't just walk in there and be like, be different. Don't have your history, right? Be different than you are now. It doesn't make sense. So, yeah.
It's interesting. Go ahead.
Well, I love what you said about being able to look unflinchingly at what happened, because I lived in Poland for a period of time. And in the south of Poland is a very notorious Nazi concentration camp. And I went and visited some of these camps, and it is really, really uncomfortable to go to these places and to realize human beings did this to other human beings. I walked into the gas chambers. I saw rooms filled with human hair. I'm getting like goosebumps. You can't see it, but like in the back of my neck, just thinking about this. And it was almost like it was too difficult to fathom the sheer volume of people or number of people that were moved through these facilities. Like I almost didn't know what to feel.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what sometimes people feel if we were actually to start to, I think, reflect on the magnitude of some of the historical injustices that took place.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm an empath. And so I start to go, I'm feeling like pretty awful on the inside right now. And my response is to try and to like deaden that and to shut down. That's like my instinctive response. Like, how do I get out of this really, really, really uncomfortable feeling? How might we navigate something like that when we're starting to come to this place of reckoning of, holy crap, like there's a lot of like bad stuff in our history.
Never mind our history. I mean, if you look at the news literally today, walking through the Ukrainian towns that have been absolutely brutalized by Russian forces. Like, we don't even have to, you don't have to go back into history at all. We can look at conflicts all around the world. And so you're absolutely right. It is incredibly easy to go down a rabbit hole of madness, like sheer madness, because your brain can't compute the horror that unfolds in certain times and places. And, if you're someone who's in coaching, or if you're in a service role, if you're in kind of like a human, service to others kind of role, it is a skill that you have to develop to be able to oscillate your empathy, to be able to turn your empathy on when you need it. Someone is hurting, my heart goes out to them. It prompts me to do the right thing in this moment, but not so much that I am just overwhelmed by the pain and suffering of others. And, a lot of folks who just define themselves as empaths are really just people with a trauma history who learned to be hypervigilant, right, to the moods and feelings of others, because that's like, let's scan the environment for danger, because that's what I need to do to survive. So it's not that they have, different or better feelings. It's just that that's, where their antenna are tuned. And so there's a lot of different metaphors for developing this. Some people talk about a bubble, right? Developing a bubble, or developing armor that's like selective. You let some things in and not others. But I think that you cannot be in the world with naked empathy all the time, because it will crush you. And this is where we get like vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. And, you become traumatized simply by witnessing or even thinking about terrible things that happen.
There was really cool. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, there's a really cool concept. Chris, Lindsay Miller, the stress nanny, and I've interviewed her twice now, and she works with kids and does some fascinating things. One of the concepts she teaches, she calls like the empathy flashlight, and she has like this little finger flashlight, and so it's like you can't light everything up all at once. You have to decide where you're going to point that flashlight and what you're going to illuminate at any given time. Sometimes it's pointed towards yourself, and you're looking, okay, what's happening inside of me? Sometimes it's pointed towards another person, but it was just, and then sometimes you have to turn it off because you need to recharge the batteries. And it was, I was like, oh, that makes
it was the perfect analogy for it, really, wasn't it?
I was like, I want one. I literally want a finger flashlight to illustrate that for people.
I think we have to challenge ourselves as people with privilege to go beyond just empathy, right? Because it's one thing for me to look at a situation and go, oh, I feel bad about that.
Right.
The truly radical thing to do is decenter our own selves and our own perspectives. And I think that is the way harder thing to do. It's like, when some celebrity dies and everyone gets on Facebook and they're like, oh, I remember when I went to go see Prince, and like they make it about themselves, right? Like somehow they're like, I need to make this meaningful by making it about me. I first heard Prince's music when I was 14, right? And that's what we do. We center ourselves. So the truly radical work, I mean, empathy is an amazing start, right? Empathy, compassion, you can't go wrong as a human being if you have these things. But the truly radical work is decentering ourselves and decentering ourselves from the center of the universe and going, oh, maybe no one needs to hear my perspective in this moment, right? Maybe I'm not the most important star player. And I felt this very much when I went to Singapore for the first time, which is it's like the city of the future, right? It's so technological, and they're just ticking along doing, I mean, it has its problems, but it's so technologically advanced in so many ways. And I remember going to the airport and just thinking, we thought that we had a pretty good airport in Toronto, Canada, but now I come here. It's like when you're a white belt and you meet the black belt, and you're like, that's the high level of achievement. And it really struck me like there's huge parts of the world that give zero craps what anyone in Canada is doing right now. And so like my very kind of North American centric perspective was just irrelevant, like in all these places in the world, right? And I know that sounds like such an elementary insight. It was early in my travels, so bear with me. But we really have to start to think about, as well-meaning people who care about progress, it's not enough to be like, oh, you can join my party. Maybe we're not even supposed to be at this party that's going on. Maybe this is someone else's party that we have crashed, and then we've gotten up on stage and we're singing drunken karaoke and everyone's like embarrassed, right? So that's really the radical work, is to decenter ourselves. And that's really hard. I mean, talk about fear of change, right? That's where the really head expandy stuff for people with privilege starts. That's the work. That's the work to do.
I think this comes into play extremely powerfully for America right now, right? Because, in the last several decades, they have been, in their opinion, our opinion. See, I'm not even thinking about myself as American. Like as the center, we're not the party crashers. We are the party. And the reality, when you live other places as an American, is you really get a much better felt sense of the fact that is not the case. And I love that experience that you explained at the Singapore airport. I had a very similar experience living in the Czech Republic, because and I didn't live in Prague. I lived in the second city in Brno, which is about halfway between Vienna and Prague. And so, two amazing cities with this third amazing city in the middle of it that nobody knows about particularly. And you go there and everything looks still pretty much from the 18th or 17th century on the outside. And then you open a door and everything inside is insanely modern and insanely up to date and just like beautiful, and it all connects. They've managed to take these facades of these old buildings and connect each building internally. So you pretty much never have to leave the inside of the building if you don't want to. You can choose to go back outside and do that, but you don't have to. They've managed to connect it all up. And they've married sort of the old and the new in such a Czech way, because and I don't want to get too far into Czech history, but it's really fascinating how they dealt with being invaded and oppressed by so many different cultures. And, the Iron Curtain itself, when it came down, the Czechs were like, whatever. It's a Velvet Revolution for a reason, because they were already doing the things they wanted to be doing. Despite all of that, on top of it, they weren't fighting it. They had a totally different approach. And I think there's so much to be learned from how different cultures handle that, and realizing that there are parties going on you don't even know are happening, right? And that's the funnest part of life, if you let it be, is actually finding those other parties.
That's funny. I just picture in my head when I was in Lithuania and we went to like this underground pub that was, you wouldn't even have known it existed, but they have in Eastern Europe, they have a lot of these places. Maybe you've seen them, right? Where you just go down this random flight of stairs and you get into this underground, thing, this old stone structure or something. And there's this whole party going. You're like, you know.
Most drinking is done underground, right? Like, I don't think people drink in the daylight in those.
I was like listening to an Eastern European metal band in like an underground establishment was quite an interesting experience.
I think the question is, how do you bring more of those experiences to the people who have the least access to them, though, so that they can gain those perspectives? Like, how do you introduce it in a way that doesn't trigger that fear response?
I mean, I guess it depends who we're talking about, right? Because there is a very particular fear response that happens in people with privilege, when they start to feel like, oh, I might lose some of this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's different. Going up the ladder is different than going down the ladder, right? And so I think the answer would be different for different groups of people. And I'm not super interested in not threatening people with privilege. I think that they're well overdue for some psychic threat to be foisted on them and to have a very difficult reckoning with reality. I think that that's just part of the process. It's kind of the truth and reconciliation concept, right? Where there has to be some truth telling, and some people have to hear and receive some very difficult, painful things. And there's no way around that process. So, for people who have always enjoyed privilege and the ability to not know or think about things, there is no smooth, easy landing in a way. It can be facilitated, skillfully, but some of it's gonna hurt.
Yeah. So avoidance is kind of really the problem, isn't it? It's that sort of
pain is this interesting thing, because I've had this thought recently, like that pain is a teacher. It's not that we necessarily go out and deliberately seek pain, like I'm going to smack my head into the wall, just, but like pain, like I'm now looking at my kid, right? And I'm like, when he does something that probably isn't very helpful, like little miniature humans are like trying to unalive themselves like recklessly multiple times a day. and sometimes I can't save him from everything. Not that I'm trying to, but like sometimes he needs to go through that painful experience to be reminded that, okay, there's a lesson here. And when you mentioned, I guess I'm trying to get your quote, but like almost like threatening people with privilege, or basically the threat is you're going to go through something that's really, really uncomfortable here, and you should go through this. Some people will hear that and they won't hear maybe the conclusion of the matter. All they hear is, you're trying to drag me through an uncomfortable experience and I don't want to go. But if you were to say, here's actually where this will take you and maybe why you should be willing to go through that experience, where might people find themselves maybe on the other side of going through this kind of painful reckoning that would make it worthwhile for them to go through it?
I love that. You're reframing my somewhat sadistic take on the topic. Inflicting pain on people. Yeah, I love that reframe, because I think the travel analogy is such a great one. When you travel, when you have experiences, and like a lot of those, when you travel, you have experiences that are uncomfortable, depending where you go, right? It's like, I don't know what this food is, and I don't know, like I need to do something and I don't know how.
Everybody just used their fingers to dive into the food on the banana leaf.
Yeah, and it's scary, and I'm lost, and I don't know who to ask for help. Like, you have all these experiences when it's just like it's like baked into the experience of traveling by and large. And what happens is that you come out the other end with an increased sense of empathy, an increased sense of shared humanity. Like, people are going to people. Like, wherever you go in the world, there's going to be some moment where you see a teenager who's just like doing teenager things. And you're like, no matter how they dress, no matter where they are, that's like, teenagers are going to teenager. And, so you come away with often a greater sense of shared humanity. You come away with a sense of respect for how other people navigate the world in different yet entirely functional ways. So you have like an increasingly broadened perspective. You have a very healthy humility, like in a way that feels good. Like, I'm no longer, again, the starring actor in this play, but actually feels kind of good. I feel like I'm sharing something with people. You have an increased sense of self-trust. I went through a difficult thing and I figured out new stuff and new skills. And now I have a sense of like increased capacity and increased resourcefulness. A good analogy, there's a guy on TikTok I just saw who traveled through a bunch of countries, and wherever he went, he asked people to share their favorite dance move with him. And then he put it all together in this kind of montage. And you're just watching this guy dance with people all over the world, all kinds of different cultures. And you're like, wow, like what kind of person would this guy be at the other end of that experience? Like, it would be transformative. So these experiences transform us in ways that are growth promoting. It's like, to bring it down to the micro level, it's like having a really hard conversation with your partner. Like when you're in it, it's so icky and you're like, whoa, God, why can't you be wrong? Like, I don't know if you ever had this moment where you're like, you're kind of getting down on your partner for something and you're like, you're doing this. And then like halfway through, you're like, it's me, isn't it?
It's me.
It's why does it have to be me all the time? Right? But so like when you're in those conversations with your partner, it's so icky and it can be frightening. Like, what if they leave me? Like, whatever, right? But when you come at the other end, if you have successfully navigated this and like really shown up to it, your bond is stronger, right? You have navigated this together. So I think we often have a fear of conflict or a fear of uncomfort in our culture. But I think, as you say, John, the good news is that you come at the other end of this so much stronger, so much more resourceful, so much more expansive as a human being, which leads to a lot more fulfillment. Like when you grapple with the hard things, you feel good about yourself ultimately, because if you don't, some part of you knows that you didn't. And that's going to stay with you forever.
So you threaten people with actually kindness in your heart because of what you'd like to see on the other side of it.
Well, I think I think if you've gone through a difficult thing, you know how it feels, right? And as a coach, I'm not a big fan of rules. I'm not a big fan of like, you should do this because blah, blah. I'm like, try this and see how it feels, both in the short term and the long term. Feel that person that you become when you try a challenge and just see what happens. And so, for everyone listening, I challenge you, like, go out and find an area where you feel uncomfortable as a human being. Maybe there's a group of people that you like have never engaged with and like, but you're curious, right? Go find someone to engage with, or you've never had a really icky conversation about a social issue with someone, maybe, who's marginalized, or maybe you're the marginalized person and you've never talked, you know what I mean? Like, go out and just have those one-on-one human connections, because that's where a lot of the healing happens.
Yeah.
So cliche to say, it's where the healing happens, but it's, it's true. Like I've had some of the most
wrong.
Right.
I've just had some of the most rad, life transforming conversations, like on buses and just like with random people that I ran into who were not like me in some way or another. And you mentioned healing, and earlier you mentioned this term intergenerational trauma. Like I have a list of like 16 more questions that I don't think we're gonna get through tonight. But I wanted to come back to that because I think this is a really fascinating concept. I'm actually going to rope Lamar into this conversation, even though he's not here, because he and I were messaging back and forth about something. And so he shared a message with me. He said, like, the world watched Will Smith listen to his wife tell him she had an affair. People laughed at Will, and he became a meme. When Tyrese Gibson had a mental breakdown online in regards to not seeing his daughter in 2 years, people laughed at him. He became a meme. When Kanye West had a mental breakdown, people called him crazy. He became a meme. And then he said, you wonder why men, and I think in this context, he's referring even more so to like Black males, don't open up about their mental health problems, because when this occurs, this is what results. And, Lamar and I have had a number of sort of deep conversations, and I'm just beginning to learn about this topic, even after like 18 months of he and I talking on a regular basis. But this idea that the trauma getting passed down and just kind of getting reinforced, and what are we really talking about when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, and how does it kind of get passed down and reinforced? Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the simplest answer is hurt people, right? So, there's been some interesting scholarship about, for example, corporal punishment in some kind of marginalized communities. And like, there's this running joke about, your mom running after you with the slipper.
The chancla.
Right? The chancla, right? And this does seem to be a universal theme across a variety of cultures. That there's something about the slipper that just strikes fear into the heart of people. And so it's played for laughs, but really what intergenerational trauma is it's okay. So if you can think about it on the social level, right down to like the individual level, right? What happens in a given family. And when a group of people or a family or whatever experiences something painful and dehumanizing and traumatizing, it affects them psychologically. It also affects them biologically. So we know, for example, that going through traumatic experiences affects epigenetic expression in the next generation. So this, for example, there's really interesting research on famines, what happens during famines and how this affects epigenetic expression. So that, if I am pregnant and I go through a famine, it affects the genetic expression of my offspring. It doesn't affect like their actual, like their DNA is already set. Maybe they're a fetus, right? They're already set, but it affects how those genes get expressed. Right?
Yep.
And so if you can imagine that being replicated over generations and generations, we know that stress can significantly affect epigenetic expression. So consider the stressors that various groups of marginalized people have been through generationally and how that would kind of replicate. And then even at the family level, if I'm dealing with crap out in the world, how can I possibly be a functioning parent? Like, I do my best, right? But I don't have skills. I don't have energy. I don't have bandwidth. I don't have time, or whatever it is I don't have. I cannot be my best parenting self to you. So, whatever manner of bad things happen, and then you go out in the world. And now you're in the cycle, right? And so the cycle is breakable, but intergenerational trauma refers to kind of these generational cycles of hurting people, hurting people. And then it can happen like at a social level, right? A social and cultural level, like a whole group of people kind of in this cycle, just reproducing and reproducing and reproducing it. And not because they're bad people, of course, but because
it's the tools they have.
They have and how they survive, right? And so, historically, you did not survive. Let's take the example of Lamar being a Black man. You did not survive by being tender, by being, empathetic, by being soft, by being vulnerable. And I'm saying soft in like an approving way, but by being vulnerable, right? You had to be a hard ass and really kind of scrabble for everything, which, and so that's how your dad raised you. That's how his dad raised him, right? And so whatever, all the way down the line. So yeah, depression, mental health, anxiety. I mean, like who has time for that, right?
Right.
And these concepts aren't even meaningful in a lot of cultures. In a lot of cultures, there's no concept of mental health. It's physical. Like people will often say, "Oh, I have a headache," when they mean I'm depressed.
Yeah.
So there's not even like consistent language across cultures. But I mean, hopefully that explains intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. It's a fascinating, I think, just concept for us to try to understand. And I often use that phrase, well, hurt people. And it at that level, it kind of helps us to get a basic understanding of, it's not to say that certain behaviors are acceptable, but say at least we can understand why the behavior is occurring. Yeah. And if we seek to understand the behavior, because again, when we try to help people create change in their life, we first want to maybe understand, how did you get there? And I'm not going to dive into my own story, but I think one of the things that helped me move past what happened to me in a traumatic sense was to actually cultivate a sense of empathy towards those who perpetrated a violent act against me, trying to understand what moved them to do that. And it doesn't mean that I thought what they did was okay or appropriate or justified, but at least I understood why it happened. And that level of understanding and even empathy for those people helped me to kind of begin to move past what had happened to me. And maybe you talk about being about decentering, like not really making it all about me in this situation. So, yeah. Now, you also use another term that I want to explore a little bit. And that is this term radical, because sometimes this term gets thrown around. In fact, I think very often when the term gets used in our language, it's used with a negative connotation. This person's a radical. In other words, watch out. This person is crazy, or this person is bad in some sense, because they're taking an approach that really hasn't been used before. Yet maybe the flip side of that is innovation, or the willingness to go outside established norms and say, let's try this.
In the 80s, radical did mean that, right? That was the term that you use for something that was super new and exciting and awesome.
Yeah, it was rad. I still like saying rad, but I'm old, so
I still say rad. I don't care what people think it is, but it is rad.
I'm in the 40s club. I can say rad.
Right.
Well, I mean, like the etymology of the word radical, or the word origin of radical, is really just to go to the root.
Yeah.
Right? So radical suggests going to the root of things, and I think if we kind of use it in its classical sense, being a radical kind of implies that you're willing to dig down to the origins of things, right? Why is this happening? Okay, why did that happen? Why did this happen? And typically what happens is you reach some kind of place where you're like, oh, I can see by asking these kinds of questions, by trying to go to the root of problems, that superficial solutions or superficial explanations are maybe not going to cut it, right? Oh, like, why does someone commit a crime? Because they're a bad person. The end. Well, like that's not helpful, right? So I think a radical is someone who questions deeply and is really looking for like the thing before the thing, right? What happened? Oh, like why did this cause this, and why did this cause this? And typically, what happens out of that line of inquiry is that you question a lot more deeply about how and why society is organized in the way that it is. So, if you question like, why do we have a minimum wage? And then you start digging in the history of that, you're like, it seems very weird to me that, 0.1% of society has concentrated all the wealth. And you know what I mean? Like you sort of intrinsically start to move towards, I think, more like bigger visions for understanding things. That's how I look at it. I mean, and the term radical feminism, that's always such it's like, radical feminists, the whatever weird concept people have. But typically, like traditionally, radical feminists were understood as people who, to differentiate them from other types of feminists, because there were all kinds of feminists, and there have been for a few hundred years actually. But a radical feminist was really someone who was quite interested in getting to the root of sexism and patriarchy, and like, where did all this stuff come from? So the term took on another meaning, but that was what differentiated them.
I can cross another term off my list. I wrote down the word patriarchy, and I don't think it came up in discussion before, but I wanted to touch on that. So I'm glad you inadvertently brought this up, because like I'm male. I think it's obvious. I hope it is. But I think oftentimes men will feel threatened by the idea of feminism, because again, it's the thought that you're trying to take something away from me in trying to advance your interests. But the idea of this concept of patriarchy, well, again, if you tackle that, you're tackling something and it will negatively affect me. But then I wonder if actually in reality, it's like there's actually a lot of men suffering as a result of sort of this hierarchical structure as well. So I wonder if we can just maybe relatively briefly touch on this idea of like sort of patriarchy and feminism, and maybe why it isn't, and actually addressing some of these things isn't actually such a negative thing for men, for example, because maybe expressing this might help people be more open to the idea of, well, let me hear about this, because maybe it isn't such a negative thing.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so patriarchy basically literally means rule of the father. And so I think this is important to mention, because what it suggests is that this is a system, right? To go back to the concept of systemic, this is a system in which resources and power are unequally distributed, in part based on gender, but not exclusively based on gender, because patriarchy is something that is intertwined. Patriarchy is still a hierarchical system, right? So it's not just like red team versus blue team. It's not like all of the dudes get everything while all of the women get nothing. Okay, it doesn't work like that. I'm imagining it's almost like this kind of hierarchical pyramid structure where you have other factors that intersect, right? Racialization, money, political power, education, like access to kind of historical institutions. There's all of these other things that make patriarchy work, so to speak. And so patriarchy is a system in which a small group of particular kinds of, masculinity or masculine associated norms are seen as the best way to do things. That's kind of how I would explain patriarchy. Now, it's not that individual men out there are not dicks about it. You know what I mean? Like sexism and misogyny. So when I say sexism, I mean unequal distribution of resources based on biological sex or gender, right? Or beliefs about the capacity and goodness of a sex, one or the other. And we know that traditionally it has been that women are seen as much more inadequate than men traditionally. Misogyny is kind of the outright hatred of women. And this, I think, is still something that runs through the culture of our society in lots of different ways. But fundamentally, again, what we're talking about is structurally unequal distribution of resources. But in order to make patriarchy work and sexism work, it's kind of like, okay, I'm a dude, and that has to mean that I am about this set of characteristics, culturally speaking, and I am not about this set of characteristics, culturally speaking. And I'm not talking about the way you feel inside yourself. I'm talking about social rules right now.
Mm-hmm.
There are social rules that say this is okay for men and women, and this is not okay for men and women. And we will grant unequal rewards and privileges to whoever fits in this box of having these criteria. Are you with me so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So if, for example, if we think about conventional norms of morality, right? What does it mean to be a moral citizen? Well, these were developed by a very specific group of people. And they have things like objectivity and reason and, that kind of stuff, logic. And it means to have this particular set of virtues. And none of this is wrong. Like, a lot of the virtues are like, yeah, that's a good one. But they exclude a lot of other ways of knowing that are then devalued. So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, but I'm a dude, like let's just cut this down to like actual concrete stuff here. I'm a dude and I don't feel powerful. That is also part of the system, because the way patriarchy works is it constrains the behavior and opportunity of everyone who is in the system. Because if you are in power, you need people to be, to have power over. So the system of patriarchy intersects with other systems like capitalism and, racism and so forth, to say to be a man in our society requires you to do X, Y, and Z, to be X, Y, and Z. And if you step outside of that, you will be punished. You will be disadvantaged. You will be, something is going to happen to you. And typically the perpetrators of those consequences are other men. So men police men's behavior fiercely within patriarchy. And it's had terrible consequences for most men, because it's like many men feel like they're unequipped to talk about mental health, to talk about emotional health, to have meaningful relationships, to have close male friendships, right? And this is not true across the board. Obviously, there's a lot of heterogeneity within it, right? But if we're talking about the traditional, like manly man, straight, white, middle-class man, it is a very constrained role that they're asked to play. And if they go outside of that, they are punished, You're like, don't cry. Like that's being, you're being like a girl. What are you, a little bitch? Don't be a pussy. Like we can just think of a million gender-based insults, right? So men actually suffer under patriarchy as well. And I think that's a really key point to bring up. It's not, again, that everyone on the man team is winning and everyone on the woman team is losing. It doesn't work like that. It's just a complex system of unequal rewards and privileges and power that is kind of like distributed predominantly to men.
And maybe we could have a thought experiment about like kind of what is being proposed as an alternative, because I wonder if sometimes the thought might be the alternative is a matriarchy, for example.
That's where everyone's mind goes. It's like, so you're saying we're going to like just be ruled by women? It's like, no, the whole point of like power over is part of the problem, right? That I would create a system that has very rigid rules for what people can do and how they can be. So, I mean, I think the alternative now, okay, having said all this about patriarchy, and again, this is systemic, right? This is enshrined in laws, it's enshrined in policies, educational institutions, even stuff like maternity leave, right?
Even stuff like getting a license where you have a maiden name and a new name. I mean, even down to that.
What's a maiden name? Like, think about the word maiden name. Does this mean like I'm a virgin and so now it's my father's name until I lose my virginity and now it's my husband? Like, it's just,
it's like there's so many aspects you don't think about.
Right. Once you start deconstructing it. So I do think there's been a ton of progress over the last, like, let's say 100 years. And I think that in certain ways, men in many cultures are now where women were, let's say, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, where they're waking up to a reality of like, I'm not happy with the role that I've been assigned. I'm not okay with the messages that I'm getting from my society, from other men around me, or from, people in power. there are things that I want to do and ways that I want to express myself and experiences that I want to have that I feel constrained about having because of my gender or my gender expression or, my biological sex or whatever. So I see signs of hope. And the alternative, of course, is something like an ecosystem, right? Within an ecosystem, everything has a place, and ideally everything is thriving in a kind of interdependent way. And so there's no rigidity. It's not like, okay, we're going to just take like this set of rigid rules and replace it with that set of rigid rules. It's like, no, the rigid rules are the problem. I think ultimately what we're going for is a society where we can have difficult conversations about power and continually work to kind of, improve situations where there is unequal power, right? Unequal access to resources. If this group can access political power, but this group can't, that's a problem. If this group can get to education easily, this group can't, that's a problem, right? So I think we want to keep working on it and improving that. At the same time, recognizing that there's going to be so many different paths for people, right? Because people are like, okay, so are you saying that men now have to stay home and take care of babies if they want? It's really about like how can you follow the path that ultimately gives you the fullest expression of yourself as a human being while enabling other people to have the resources to do the same for themselves. So constantly working to create a more equitable and just and fair society. I think the ultimate goal is fairness.
It's a real basic human principle, fairness, right? And it's woven through every system that we've ever created for ourselves. And I think it's really interesting when you're able to peel away some of what seem like rigid requirements. And when you realize that it's actually an incredibly flexible system, as long as people's basic needs get met, like we can make up any rules we want.
Yeah.
Right. And recognizing that that's not scary, that's beneficial for everyone. Right. But it often gets reduced to this binary choice of like you say, well, what are we going to swap patriarchy for? Matriarchy? Well, no, that we're not actually changing things. And John, you and I have talked about this a lot in different aspects of like, if you can see the framework, if you can see the belief systems at play, then you're much more capable of changing them without threat.
I kind of think about it like the bumper rails on a bowling alley, where they're there to kind of maybe stop you from ending up in the gutter, but between them, there's quite a bit of room to maneuver. There's not just a single kind of straight shot that you necessarily follow. And again, I'm loving that because this is sort of naturally progressing towards kind of three other things on my list here in this conversation. But it's this intersection of like, we talked about artificial scarcity, distribution of resources, and I wrote down capitalism and communism because they're kind of, I guess, held up as like sort of polar opposites, and socialism is kind of like this boogeyman down in the US. Like we don't talk about that down here because that makes you whatever slur you want to throw out there kind of thing. But this is what we're kind of grappling with, this place of reckoning where we're coming to, where it's like, wow, we just watched, even over the last couple of years, the accumulation of wealth in the top like 0.001% of people, where they control 80% of the world's wealth. And you go, and the other 99.996% of people are sitting here going, no wonder it feels like scarcity. It's not because there's a scarcity of resources available to us, but the extreme inequitable distribution. And how do we effectively go about rectifying this extreme inequity or inequality without, or maybe it can't be done, I don't know. I want to be careful what I suggest here on social media, but without some kind of violent shift, is there a way to maybe come about and this kind of reckoning?
I think it's really interesting because history is a great teacher here, right? And I love when people start saying like communism or socialism or whatever. These are just all systems we've tried out. We're just trying out systems, right? And the assumption that we've come across a system that functions across all domains perfectly and we've accidentally bended, or, we're using the perfect one now, and if we could just right the ship, it would be fine. I think the reality is that like no one's quite figured it out 100% yet. And I think that's where we want to try to stay, because as soon as we decide too rigidly that this system has to work or that system has to work, we lose the ability to like pivot. When we talk about innovation or disruption, we can't do that as a society if we get too fixed on any one concept. And I think Good.
I was going to say, I think like in order to evaluate any system, we kind of have to ask ourselves, like, does this work for everyone, especially the people who are most vulnerable and most marginalized? And that's really the litmus test, right? It goes back to the sidewalk curb cuts, right? Yep. Can someone in a wheelchair get down this sidewalk? If every single person, more or less, who can locomote, if that's a word, get down this sidewalk, then great. It should be. I feel like it should be. You know, and so that is really like just a really simple question to ask yourself. Is everyone in our society, especially the most vulnerable, okay? Are they getting what they need? Are they thriving? Are they able to express themselves in the fullest way? You know, all kinds of people are struggling to express themselves in the fullest way, but I think that the litmus test is how a society treats its most vulnerable and its most marginalized members. And we've seen this with the pandemic. Like the rhetoric has started to shift to like, you know what, they're old. Like let's just clean out, like, you know, like it's the fine. Rhetoric is right. It's messed up. It's like, oh, people had pre-existing conditions. Oh, people were old. It's like, are we just like, is this some kind of like covert eugenics program now, where we just kind of like go, well, you know what, if you have cardiac problems, like just get off the stage? Like that's kind of starting to be what it sounds like. And that's not a society that I want to live in, where we don't care for people who are vulnerable. So, you know, regardless of whatever we come up with, it has to pass that test. Can people thrive in this ecosystem?
I personally 1,000% agree with that. And I think that should be the benchmark for how we structure a lot of what we're doing. But I think the reality is not everyone agrees with that. Not everybody functions from that place of collective well-being. And that's where you get systems that are imbalanced. And I think that's the thing we've really got to address, is like, how do we move people away from thinking that that's a superior system, that that's somehow going to work better, right?
I think like one of the key points here is that sometimes when you are embedded in the system, you cling to whatever little shred you can get, right? Like, even though the system is screwing you too, like patriarchy screws over men too.
Yeah.
Capitalism screws over most people, except whatever billionaire is currently shooting themselves into space, right? So I think it's really
on a phallic rocket.
Phallic rocket, right? And so, like, as we kind of investigate our own perspectives, it's really important to consider: am I buying into a system that ultimately disadvantages me just because it's familiar? And I think an example of that is like people who hold very conservative financial views, despite being low income. It's like, you are directly getting screwed by people who don't believe in minimum wage. Like, you are living that. And yet, you know, you have that cognitive dissonance. So we have to really do a lot of work to investigate our cognitive dissonance about systems too. What do we see and not see? And what can we afford to not see?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, my mind goes to a whole bunch of places, but I'm thinking like the U.S. is printing money like it's nobody's business. But what seems to be really interesting about this still, again, is there are systems in place, if I could put it that way, in a sense, and maybe not even necessarily deliberately, but there are systems in place that are permitting, let's say, for example, the big five, in terms of largest corporations by market capitalization, permitting them to essentially vacuum up these dollars and crush any kind of competition. And so, you know, hey, it's great that we're getting, you know, a stimulus checks, which sounds like a really sort of benign kind of term here. And I'm not necessarily against or opposed to that. But what we witness is once that money hits circulation, it's getting vacuumed up into one corner, and then it's not coming back into circulation. And then we just see like absurd or obscene numbers. I don't know if it was Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, or one of them hit like something like at a certain point, like 328 billion, or maybe I'm a little bit off, but I thought it was like really some ridiculous number where I was like, and it's obviously it's paper wealth. But hitting these obscene numbers, and it's like, why does one human being ever need access to like this kind of degree of resources? And maybe this is where, you know, some of this talk around communism, and I'm not trying to glorify it in a sense, but what we're trying to say is I think the aims of communism were something along the lines of like collectivist control of resources, where it's where it's like we're all getting at least a little bit of a stake in deciding how these resources get distributed versus a few like central power brokers.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And this goes back to, what I was saying earlier about threads and stories, right? When I like to look up the origins of words. I think that's fascinating. I realize that doesn't make me cool, but
I think it makes you cool. I love that too. I do that a lot.
But I think I think that's fascinating to see the evolution of language and the evolution of ideas about language and what people were trying to express and kind of how that became something else. Language is a very dynamic, living thing, and I think the same thing is true of political systems. And again, it's like if you look back and learn the stories about things, you gain more understanding of like, oh, like that's what they were thinking when they did this. Like, I went back and I read Karl Marx in fact, I spent quite a lot of time reading Karl Marx, in the original back when I was in grad school, and there was so much other stuff in there that in historical context made a ton of sense. And I've seen a bumper sticker said something like, unions, the people who brought you the weekend, right? And so like in 2022, it's really, well, I mean, it's a little bit different in 2022 because Amazon's now, pushing to unionize. Like the conversation around unions is shifting again. But there was a time when being anti-union was really cool. And it's like, okay, you guys don't understand how shitty work was 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. Like there was stuff that could happen on a work site that like would be astonishing to someone in 2022. Like, oh, hey, you got a 3-year-old? Sure, stick in the machine, no problem, right? 14-hour days, no worries. 7 days a week, yeah, cool. Like you get 1 shilling or whatever the going rate would be to just barely keep you alive. And I think, people, if we don't know our history, we don't understand where ideas come from, where systems come from, how they were replicated, what propped them up. Were there other competing systems? That's the other piece. It's like taxonomy is a great example. Scientific taxonomy. There were multiple competing systems of taxonomy when they were originated. One just happened to win. It doesn't even mean it was the best one. So, I feel like we're just circling back around this concept of knowing the histories and knowing the threads and taking the time to investigate, where do my beliefs come from about what is right and good? And do they go back, like, do the origins of these go back further than I anticipate? I think if you're sort of like Gen Z or millennial, you're like, oh, history has just started. I saw something online that was like, to all your old people who were born in the 1900s. And I'm like, really? Like,
I saw that too. That was painful. I was like, oh,
God damn.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yeah. But like, so we have to, like a lot of our ideas though go back a really, really long time, or they've popped up and disappeared and popped up and disappeared, or they've appeared like spontaneously in other cultures, like parallel evolution. So, whatever your belief system, if you're listening to this and you're like, I believe this or that, go and investigate it, like really dig down into it. And, I did that with feminism. I spent multiple years, working on that. Like you could only benefit from really thinking deeply about why you believe something. And I don't know, maybe that's kind of a good note to bring it home on, or a good note to end it on.
I feel like you brought it right back around full circle to education. Actually, in that moment, I was like, and here we are, right back at education and critical thinking, and the value of deep questioning and true understanding of concepts, right? And language particularly, right? Like language is fascinating. And when you think about how many languages there are, they're all different systems for viewing the world. Yeah. And interpreting what we see and feel and interact with. And that's like, want to make your head hurt. Like that in and of itself, there's that many different ways to perceive just from the human perspective. And they're teaching dogs to use talking buttons because even dogs can figure it out, and I think when you realize that like there's so much commonality. And if you look at the patterns and you can step away and start to see the patterns, and I hate to go and make a really dorky sci-fi reference, but it's like seeing the Matrix, right? Like, these are the patterns that occur, right? These are the things that we keep experiencing. And, what's the saying? It's something like a pattern you can't see is a pattern you're doomed to repeat, right? So, and I think education is a huge component of that. So, to bring it right back around, like we've got to start by fixing what's gone wrong for us in education.
So 2 things. One, I want to say thank you to both of you for being a part of this conversation. there's so much more I want to ask, but I also want to respect your time, and we're just going to have to do this again. But I love being in the room where these conversations take place. And if anybody is still listening up to this point, I'm really glad. But I was indulging myself very selfishly in this conversation because my insatiable curiosity. So thank you so much for being generous with your time and indulging me in this really, really thoroughly enjoyable conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm really glad you opened up the space to have to talk about things like patriarchy. And I think, as a father of a new little one, I mean, that is a beautiful opportunity to question like all of the received wisdom that you got growing up, and to ask yourself, like, what kind of person do I want to be in the world as I transmit things to this new little person? And it's an amazing opportunity. So kind of like the closing, if I could close on like a positive note, not that all men have to be fathers to make this work, but it is, for a lot of guys, an amazing opportunity to really go deep on this one and really think and to choose different actions in the world.
And mothers of sons as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot there as well. Just observing some of my friends who've had sons versus daughters and the differences there. I think women have a part to play here as well.
We can all be rad. We can all be rad in the cool 80s sense of it.
Excellent. Yes.
We're going to wind up on that note, but I think there's a whole bunch of awesome conversations that might be had down in the future again. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and stay tuned for next week when it's going to be an interesting one.
Created a foundation of basing who we are on the response we get from people. People are expressing to somebody else out of the dislike maybe for themselves. When you can respond with compassion, you've learned to develop a certain amount of love and respect and appreciation for yourself.
Compassion allows us to look at these things and to see them as they are, with a desire to understand without the need to judge. And in that space, that's where we create powerful transformational change.